The summer air hung thick and heavy, the kind of heat that made the pavement sizzle beneath your feet. Jamal Carter wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped out of the corner store, a cold bottle of Gatorade in one hand, his phone in the other. The moment he twisted the cap open and took a sip, the chill rushed down his throat, offering a brief moment of relief from the relentless sun. It was a lazy Saturday afternoon, and the streets of Hillside Estates, an affluent suburban neighborhood just outside of D.C., were quiet. The kind of quiet that made Jamal feel like an intruder, even though he had every right to be there. This wasn't just any neighborhood. It was his neighborhood. The Carters had moved here 2 years ago when his mother, Renee Carter, accepted a high-profile promotion with the FBI. Jamal was proud of her. Everyone was. She was a powerhouse in law enforcement, known for breaking barriers and taking down criminals without breaking a sweat. But none of that mattered when he was walking down these streets alone. Jamal adjusted the straps on his backpack and started the short walk home, taking the usual route past a row of large, colonial-style houses, each with perfectly manicured lawns and driveways lined with luxury cars. The kind of homes that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread, with families that probably hosted brunches on Sundays and sipped iced tea on their porches. He was halfway down the block when he noticed her. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling at the back of his neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He glanced up, and sure enough, there she was, a white woman, mid-40s, blonde bob, Lululemon leggings, and a tank top that read, Mom Mode, Activated. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed, her sharp blue eyes locked onto him like a hawk spotting prey. Jamal exhaled slowly. He had seen this look before. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here," the look that made his stomach twist, even when he knew he had done nothing wrong. He kept walking, forcing himself to stay relaxed. Just keep moving, man. You know the drill, he thought. The last thing he wanted was to look nervous. Looking nervous could be dangerous. The woman, Karen Whitmore, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, didn't move. She didn't wave or offer the polite nod that most neighbors exchanged when passing each other on the street. Instead, she reached for her phone, her expression tightening. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. Number she wouldn't, not for just walking home. But he had seen enough stories to know better. Karen turned slightly, angling her body away as she held the phone to her ear. Jamal slowed his steps, straining to hear. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood," she said in a hushed voice. "A young black male, maybe 16 or 17. He's walking down Oakwood Drive. I don't recognize him." Jamal's stomach dropped. Seriously? He wasn't carrying anything but his phone and a bottle of Gatorade. He wasn't cutting through yards or looking in windows. He wasn't even wearing a hoodie, just a plain t-shirt and basketball shorts. Yet here she was, calling the cops on him. Jamal wanted to scream, wanted to march up to her and ask what exactly made him suspicious. But he knew that wouldn't help. So instead, he just kept walking, gripping his phone a little tighter. He wanted to call his mom, wanted to tell her what was happening, but the last thing he wanted was for her to worry. So he swallowed his frustration and picked up the pace. But Karen wasn't done. "I don't know if he's armed," she continued, "but he looks out of place. He's just lingering. Lingering." Jamal nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Walking home was lingering now? He shook his head, his jaw clenched. This was the reality of being him, being black in a neighborhood where people like Karen saw his presence as a threat. And the worst part? He knew how this played out. The cops would come, they would question him, maybe put their hands on him, maybe worse. Jamal thought about running, just sprinting the rest of the way home, but running would make him look guilty, so he did the hardest thing he could do. He slowed down, breathed, and prayed. The distant wail of sirens sliced through the heavy summer air. Jamal's heart pounded. He turned onto the next block, only a few houses away from his own, when the squad car appeared, its flashing lights painting streaks of red and blue across the pavement. Here we go, he thought. The tires screeched as the car came to a sharp stop right in front of him, blocking his path. The door flew open, and a uniformed officer stepped out, hand already hovering over his holster. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. Jamal froze. Everything around him, the chirping cicadas, the rustling leaves, the distant hum of lawnmowers, seemed to fade into silence. A knot formed in his throat as his breath came in short, uneven bursts. "Stay calm. Don't move too fast. Don't reach for your pockets." He forced himself to speak, though his voice came out tight. "Sir, I didn't do anything." "Drop what's in your hand." Jamal's fingers curled around his phone and Gatorade. He hesitated. Did he mean the phone? The drink? His mind raced. He had seen too many cases, too many names turned into hashtags, where a simple movement cost someone their life. Behind him, Karen stood on her porch, arms folded, watching like she had just ordered a package and was waiting for it to be delivered. "Drop it, kid!" the officer snapped again. Jamal exhaled shakily and slowly, let the Gatorade fall to the ground, the plastic bottle bouncing against the pavement. "I live here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer scoffed. "Yeah? Prove it." Jamal clenched his jaw, forcing back the heat of frustration crawling up his spine. "I will," he said. "Just call my mom." "And who's your mother?" Jamal lifted his chin, his voice steady now. "Her name is Special Agent Renee Carter." The officer's smirk faltered, but he still didn't let go of his holster. Jamal exhaled, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. "Come on, Mom! Pick up the phone!" And just like that, the story was no longer just about him. It was about the moment everyone in this neighborhood was about to remember forever. The moment the words left Jamal's mouth, the world around him seemed to slow. "Her name is Special Agent Renee Carter." The officer's expression didn't change immediately. His fingers still lingered near his holster, his stance rigid with authority. His partner, a younger officer with a buzz cut, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching but not interfering. For a few seconds, there was only silence, except for the steady hum of an approaching police radio, crackling softly from inside the squad car. Jamal's chest tightened. He had given them his mother's name. He had played the only card he had left: the truth. And yet something told him it wasn't enough. The officer, his name tag, read Daniels, narrowed his eyes. "Special Agent, huh?" he said, his tone edged with doubt. "That's a big title for a kid like you to throw around." Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew what that meant. He had heard it before, felt it before. That unspoken accusation, woven between the words. "A kid like you." It meant, "You're lying." It meant, "Someone like you can't have a mother like that." It meant, "You still have to prove yourself." Jamal forced himself to keep his breathing steady. "She's my mother," he repeated. "Call her." Daniels glanced at his partner, then back at Jamal. His eyes flickered toward the phone on the ground, the one Jamal had been forced to drop. "You got ID on you?" Daniels asked. Jamal fought the urge to roll his eyes. "It's in my backpack," he said carefully. Daniels' hand twitched. "Don't move," he ordered, his voice sharper now. "Tell me where exactly." Jamal exhaled slowly. Side pocket, left side. Daniels hesitated for a moment, then nodded to his partner. "Check it." Buzzcut moved forward, keeping a wary distance, as if Jamal might suddenly lunge at him. He unzipped the backpack and pulled out Jamal's wallet. "Driver's permit," Buzzcut muttered, flipping through the cards. He turned it so Daniels could see. Says his last name's Carter. Daniels took a step closer, his eyes scanning the card. Jamal could see the doubt flicker just for a second before Daniels tucked the wallet back into the backpack. But still, no apology. No backing down, because that wasn't how this worked. "Dispatch," Daniels said, pressing a button on his shoulder radio. "I need to confirm an ID, possible relation to an FBI agent." Jamal could hear the static-filled response, though the words were garbled. Daniels nodded, then pulled out his own phone. "Let's see if this Special Agent Carter picks up," he muttered. Jamal's stomach clenched. His mom had always warned him about situations like this. If you're ever stopped, stay calm, don't argue, and give them my name. But even with all her advice, even with all her power, Jamal had never been more aware of the fact that, in this moment, these cops still held control over him. And that scared him. Daniels dialed, raising the phone to his ear. The call rang once, twice. Then, "This is Chief Carter." The shift was immediate. Jamal knew his mother's voice well, calm, authoritative, the kind that demanded respect before you even realized you were giving it. Daniels blinked, suddenly standing up a little straighter. Chief Carter?" he repeated, his voice uncertain now. "This is Officer Daniels with the Hillside Police Department. We have a young man here who claims to be your son." There was a pause. Jamal could almost picture his mother at her desk, her sharp eyes narrowing as she processed the situation. Then, her voice came through, cold as steel. "You have my son?" she repeated, slow and deliberate. Daniels hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. We received a call about a suspicious person in the neighborhood, and you detained him?" Jamal could practically hear the shift in her tone, the razor's edge of restrained fury. Daniels swallowed hard. "Well, we were just—" "Stay where you are," his mother interrupted. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." And then the line went dead. Jamal watched as Daniels lowered the phone, a strange look crossing his face. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the realization that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But instead of admitting it, Daniels turned his gaze back to Jamal, his face hardening again. "Sit tight," he said stiffly. Jamal let out a slow breath, his hands still clenched at his sides. He wasn't in cuffs, but it didn't matter, because this wasn't about the cuffs. It was about the fact that, even now, after confirming his identity, these men still looked at him like he was the problem, like he had done something wrong. Jamal lifted his gaze toward Karen, who was still standing on her porch. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Maybe she hadn't expected things to escalate this far. Maybe she thought the police would just question him, scare him a little, and send him on his way. But now, with the way Daniels was shifting uneasily, with the way his partner kept glancing toward the road, it was clear that something had changed, something Karen hadn't anticipated. Jamal exhaled through his nose, steadying himself, because she was about to learn exactly who his mother was. And this time, she wouldn't be the one in control of the situation. For the first time, that afternoon, a small flicker of hope bloomed in Jamal's chest. Because if there was one person in this world who could turn this moment upside down, it was Renee Carter, and she was on her way. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Jamal stood still, his heart pounding in his chest, like the bass in a trap song, but his face remained calm, neutral. He had learned long ago that showing too much emotion in moments like this could backfire. It was a delicate balance, looking compliant, but not weak, respectful, but not submissive. The flashing lights of the squad car cast eerie red and blue shadows across the pavement, and though Jamal wasn't handcuffed, he might as well have been. The officers stood around him like a loose cage, their hands never straying too far from their belts. He could still feel Karen's gaze burning into him from her porch, like she was watching a show she had directed, but now wasn't sure how it would end. She shifted on her front steps, arms folded tightly. Jamal wanted to look at her, to hold her stare, to make her feel some fraction of the humiliation and anger bubbling inside him. But he didn't. He kept his eyes on the street because he knew she wasn't the real threat anymore. The real threat had badges and guns, and they still didn't seem to believe he belonged here. Then suddenly, a black Chevrolet Suburban came tearing down the street, engine growling like a beast let loose. It moved fast, too fast for a quiet suburban neighborhood like this. The moment the officers saw it, their postures changed. Jamal could see it in the way Daniels' shoulders tensed, the way Buzzcut instinctively stepped back. The SUV didn't roll to a stop. It commanded the road. The tires screeched as the brakes engaged, the vehicle jerking to a halt just behind the squad car. The driver's side door flew open before the engine had fully cut off. And then, there she was, Chief Renee Carter, Jamal's mother. She stepped out in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, the kind of sharp, pressed fabric that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle in its life. Her dark brown skin glowed under the afternoon sun, her natural curls pulled back into a sleek bun, not a hair out of place. But it was her eyes, those piercing, steel-cold eyes, that did all the talking. They locked onto Officer Daniels first, pinning him in place like a bug under a microscope. The man visibly swallowed. Jamal had seen his mother in work mode before, but never like this. Never with him at the center of the storm. She shut the car door without looking, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she strode toward them, her posture radiating authority. Not anger, not frustration, power. Daniels tried to regain his composure, but it was clear. He already knew he had screwed up. "Chief Carter," he started, his voice forced into something polite, something professional. Where is my son?" Renee cut him off, her voice cool as ice. Daniels faltered for half a second before motioning toward Jamal, as if she needed help identifying her own child. "He's right here, ma'am. We, responded to a report of a suspicious person in the area, and you detained him," she finished for him. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Daniels hesitated. "We were just following protocol, ma'am. He matched the description of—" Renee tilted her head slightly. "What description?" Silence. Jamal watched as Daniels struggled for an answer, his tongue momentarily failing him. Then, without breaking eye contact, his mother turned her gaze toward Karen. The woman actually flinched. "Was it you?" Renee asked, her voice smooth, even. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting between the officers, Jamal and his mother. I didn't recognize him," she stammered. "He was just standing there, and I didn't know if—" "You didn't recognize him?" Renee repeated, stepping forward now, closing the distance between them. "Did you ever think to ask his name?" Karen's lips parted, but nothing came out. "Or did you assume?" Karen's face flushed deep red. "I was just looking out for the neighborhood," she muttered. Renee let out a slow breath, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the officers. "Let me get this straight," she said. "My son, a 16-year-old boy, was walking home in his own neighborhood when this woman called you, and instead of asking him questions, instead of exercising an ounce of common sense, you pulled up on him like he was a suspect." Neither officer spoke. "Did you search him?" Daniels cleared his throat. "No, ma'am, we didn't." "But you forced him to drop his belongings." Daniels' jaw tightened. "For officer safety, we—" For officer safety? Renee cut him off again, a sharp edge creeping into her tone. You mean to tell me a child with a bottle of Gatorade made you feel unsafe? Buzzcut shifted uncomfortably. Daniels tried again. Ma'am, we were just responding to... You were responding to bias, Renee said, her voice firm now, every word landing like a hammer. Bias that put my son's life in danger. Because let's be honest, if he had reacted wrong, if he had moved too fast, raised his voice, or God forbid, reached for his phone. A heavy silence fell. Jamal swallowed, because they all knew exactly how that story ended. Renee exhaled through her nose, calming herself, but when she spoke again, there was no mistaking the fury beneath her words. I don't want to hear another excuse, she said. What I do want to hear is an explanation for why you didn't de-escalate this situation before it got this far. Daniel's face was a mask of embarrassment and frustration, but he didn't dare challenge her. Ma'am, we made a mistake, he admitted finally, his voice stiff. We should have handled this differently. Jamal's eyes widened slightly. He had never heard a cop say those words before. Renee didn't nod, didn't accept it. Instead, she took a slow step closer, her voice dropping low. Let me make something clear, she said, her tone like razor wire. If my son had been harmed today, if this situation had gone another way, you wouldn't be standing here trying to justify it. You'd be facing me in a courtroom. Do you understand? Daniel swallowed again. Yes, ma'am. Good. Renee turned to Jamal now, and just like that, the steel in her eyes softened. You okay, baby? She asked, her voice gentler now. Jamal nodded, his throat thick. Yeah. She gave him a once-over, as if checking for invisible wounds. Then, with a deep breath, she turned back to Daniels. I'll be filing a formal complaint with your department, she said, and I expect a written apology delivered to my home, to my son. Daniels nodded stiffly. Renee finally turned, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. Let's go, she murmured. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, this part was. Because for the first time, Jamal wasn't the one who had to walk away. They were. The ride home was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy kind. The kind that sat in the air like an uninvited guest, thick and suffocating. Jamal sat in the passenger seat of the Suburban, his hands clasped together in his lap, staring out the window. The streets of the neighborhood blurred past. Familiar houses with neatly trimmed lawns and cars parked in driveways, all looking the same as they had that morning. And yet, everything felt different. His mother hadn't spoken a word since pulling away from the scene. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale against her brown skin. Her face was unreadable, but Jamal knew better than to mistake that for calm. She was furious. Not the explosive kind of anger, but the slow, burning, dangerous kind. The kind that built and built until it had to go somewhere. Jamal exhaled softly. He had known this moment was coming, the moment where the shock wore off, and his mother's FBI training gave way to something far more personal. Mom, he started. Not yet, she said. Her voice was steady, controlled, but he heard it, the way she was holding something back, forcing herself to stay composed. Jamal shut his mouth. The tires hummed against the pavement as they turned onto their street. The Suburban rolled smoothly into the driveway of their two-story home, and Renee put it in park, but she didn't move. For a few long seconds, she just sat there, staring through the windshield. Then, finally, she turned to him. Are you okay? She asked. Jamal hesitated. It was a simple question, one that should have had a simple answer. But the truth was, he didn't know. Was he okay? Physically? Sure. But there was something else. Something lingering in his chest, in his stomach. A mix of humiliation, anger, and something he didn't want to name because it felt too close to fear. Jamal swallowed. I don't know, he admitted. His mother's face softened just a fraction. She reached over, resting a hand on his. Warm, steady. You don't have to be, she said. Not right now. Jamal nodded, looking down at their hands. He wasn't sure why, but that made his throat tighten. His mother sighed, leaning back in her seat. I should have been there sooner, she muttered. Jamal's head snapped up. Mom, no. Yes, she interrupted, her jaw tightening. I should have been there before they even had a chance to put their hands on you. Jamal frowned. You can't be everywhere, Mom, he said. You shouldn't have to be. Her eyes flickered with something raw, something that made her look not just like Chief Carter, but his mom. Maybe, she murmured, but I still failed you today. Jamal shook his head. You didn't fail me. His mother gave a humorless chuckle. Then why does it feel like I did? Jamal didn't have an answer for that. For a while, they just sat there. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. A bird chirped somewhere in the distance, oblivious to everything. Then finally, Renee sighed. Come inside, she said. Jamal nodded and followed her out of the car, stepping into the house they had lived in for the past 5 years. It was a nice place. Open floor plan, warm lighting, family pictures on the walls. A home his mother had worked her ass off to give him. Jamal barely made it to the couch before his phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket and glanced at the screen. A text from his best friend, Devin. Yo, you good? Just saw a post about you on Nextdoor. Jamal frowned. Nextdoor? The neighborhood app? He quickly opened the link Devin had sent, and there it was, a post from Karen. Subject, Suspicious Activity in the Neighborhood Today. Posted by Karen J. I wanted to share something that happened earlier today, in case we need to be more vigilant. I saw a young man I didn't recognize, loitering near a neighbor's house. I didn't want to assume the worst, but with everything going on in the world, you can never be too careful. I called the police to check on things, and it turns out he was actually the son of an FBI agent. Crazy, right? Just goes to show. You never know. Stay safe, everyone. Jamal felt his stomach twist. Are you kidding me? He muttered. His mother leaned over, reading the post over his shoulder. Her face darkened. She really just... Jamal let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. She made herself the victim. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She made you the warning. Jamal exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The comments under Karen's post were already rolling in. Some people agreed with her, talking about being extra careful these days. Others called her out, saying she had overreacted. And then there were the ones that made Jamal's blood run cold. She did the right thing. He could have been casing houses. If he wasn't doing anything wrong, why did the cops stop him? Bet he had an attitude when they questioned him. They always do. Jamal's hands clenched around his phone. They always do. Because they didn't see him. They saw a stereotype, a statistic, something to be feared. Renee sighed beside him, rubbing her temples. This is what I mean, she murmured. I can get an apology from the police, but I can't change this. Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat. You shouldn't have to, he muttered. Why do we have to be the ones constantly proving we belong? That we're worthy of just existing in peace? His mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled him into a hug. A firm, unwavering hug. I don't know, she admitted, but I do know you're not alone in this. Jamal exhaled into her shoulder, letting himself lean into the embrace. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time that day, he felt seen. And that was something. The house felt different. Jamal had lived here for 5 years, knew every creak in the hardwood floors, every shift in the air when the AC kicked in. But tonight, the space around him felt heavier, like the walls had absorbed the tension from earlier and weren't letting it go. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. His mother sat across from him at the table, her plate barely touched. Jamal pushed his food around with his fork, appetite long gone. Neither of them had spoken much since they read Karen's post, but the weight of unspoken words pressed against the air between them. Jamal had so many thoughts tangled inside him, but he didn't know how to say any of them. How do you explain the feeling of being seen as a threat in your own neighborhood? How do you put into words the exhaustion of always having to prove you're not a problem? He stabbed at a piece of chicken, but didn't lift it to his mouth. His mother sighed, setting her fork down. "You're not eating," Jamal shrugged. "Not really hungry." She studied him for a moment. "You want to talk about it?" "Talk about what?" he asked, voice flat. "How a woman who's seen me ride my bike down this street for years suddenly thinks I'm a criminal? Or how people in the comments think I deserved what happened? Or maybe how I'm just supposed to move on like nothing happened because no one actually cares." The words tumbled out faster than he meant them to, his voice rising slightly by the end. Renee folded her hands together on the table. "I care," Jamal let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah, you do. But what does that change?" His mother didn't answer right away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "It changes that you're not alone in this," she said. "It changes that someone sees you, really sees you." Jamal looked away, jaw tight. "I get it, Mom," he muttered. "I do, but I just feel so tired." Renee's face softened, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I know, baby." That just made it worse, because she did know. She had lived it. She had grown up navigating a world that never gave people like them the benefit of the doubt. She had spent her life proving herself over and over again, working twice as hard to get half as much respect. And even now, as an FBI chief, she still had to walk a fine line. Jamal dropped his fork, rubbing a hand down his face. "It's not even just Karen," he admitted. "It's everything. It's the way the cops looked at me, the way I had to stay perfectly still because I knew one wrong move could change everything. It's knowing that if you weren't my mom, I don't know how that situation would have ended." Renee's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know," she said again. And she did, because they had both seen the headlines, the names, the faces, the ones who hadn't made it home. Jamal clenched his fists. "I don't want to live like this," he said, voice cracking. "I don't want to have to think about every little thing I do, just so I don't scare people." His mother reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "You shouldn't have to," she murmured. "But I do," he shot back, pulling his hand away. "That's the problem. I do." Renee exhaled, leaning back in her chair. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of the fridge and the distant sound of cars passing outside. Then softly, she spoke. "When I was your age, something like this happened to me." Jamal frowned. "What?" She nodded. "I was 16, walking home from a friend's house. A cop pulled up, said I matched a description. I was wearing a hoodie. He told me to put my hands where he could see them." Jamal swallowed hard. "What happened?" Her gaze was distant now, like she was watching the memory play out in front of her. "My father, your grandfather, came outside before things escalated." The officer backed off. "But I remember standing there, heart pounding, thinking, if I say the wrong thing, I might not make it home." Jamal felt his stomach twist. That was decades ago, and yet here he was, 16, feeling the exact same fear his mother had felt at his age. Had anything really changed? You know why I joined the FBI? Renee asked suddenly. Jamal shook his head. Because I was tired of feeling powerless, she said. I was tired of watching people like us get swallowed up by a system that never gave us a chance. I thought, if I can be in the room, if I can make decisions, maybe I can change something. Jamal let that sink in. But did you? He asked quietly. Did you change anything? His mother looked at him for a long moment. Not as much as I want to, she admitted. Not as much as needs to be changed. But some days I do. Some days I help someone who wouldn't have gotten justice otherwise. Some days I push back against the same bias that almost took you from me today. Jamal swallowed hard, looking down at the table. So what do I do? He finally asked. Just keep my head down? Just let it go? Renee shook her head. Number, you speak. You tell your story. You make them see you for who you are, not who they assume you to be. Jamal exhaled. And what if they still don't listen? His mother's eyes softened. Then we make them listen. Jamal stared at her, feeling something shift inside him. For hours, he had felt powerless, small, like he was just waiting for something else to happen. But now, he felt something different. He felt like fighting back. Not with anger, not with violence, but with truth. He reached for his phone. Jamal? His mother asked. I'm going to post about it, he said, voice steady. Renee raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Yeah, he said. People need to know what happened. They need to know the truth, not just Karen's twisted version of it. His mother studied him for a moment, then nodded. Then tell it, she said. Jamal took a deep breath, opened his notes app, and started typing. For the first time that day, he felt in control, and that was power. Jamal stared at the blank screen of his phone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The words were there, swirling in his head, pressing against his chest, but actually writing them? That was something else entirely. He glanced up at his mother. She was watching him with quiet patience, letting him take the lead. She wasn't going to tell him what to say. This was his story, his moment. He took a deep breath and started typing. Today I was almost arrested in my own neighborhood. Why? Because a white woman saw a black kid standing outside a house and assumed I didn't belong. He paused, staring at the words on the screen. His heartbeat picked up, but he kept going. She called the cops, and they showed up, ready to believe her. I had to stay perfectly still, barely breathe, because I knew that one wrong move could turn me into another statistic, another name on a list. Jamal's fingers clenched around the phone. He had heard the names before. Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, names of kids like him, kids who never got the chance to explain themselves. He shook his head and kept typing. They didn't ask questions. They didn't assume I had a reason to be there. They saw my skin and decided I was a threat. The only thing that saved me was the fact that my mom is the FBI chief. If she wasn't, I don't know how this story would have ended. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to finish. This is what it means to be black in America. To always be seen as a suspect before being seen as a person. To be guilty until proven innocent, if we even get the chance to prove it. Jamal read over the words, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. It felt like a weight was pressing on him. A mix of fear, anger, and something else. Something like power. His mother leaned over, scanning the screen. Are you ready for people to see this? She asked. Jamal swallowed. I think so. She nodded, and that was all he needed. He hit post. And just like that, the truth was out in the world. The response was immediate. His phone started buzzing within minutes. First with a text from Devin. Devin. Bro, damn. I'm sharing this right now. Then another from his cousin, Maya. Maya. This needs to go viral. People need to hear this. And then the comments started rolling in. Some were supportive. This is heartbreaking. I'm so sorry this happened to you. We need to do better. This kind of thing shouldn't still be happening. Thank you for sharing your story. I'm listening. But then, of course, there were the others. Maybe don't hang around places you don't belong. Cops wouldn't stop you if you weren't acting suspicious. Race baiting for attention. Typical. Jamal exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Wow, he muttered. They really don't get it. His mother looked up from her own phone, where she was reading through the replies. They don't want to get it, she corrected. Because if they did, they'd have to admit the system is broken. Jamal shook his head. I don't get how people can be this blind. Renee sighed. Because it's easier to believe we're the problem than to admit they're part of it. Jamal's phone buzzed again, this time a notification from his post. His stomach dropped. Karen had commented. Karen J. I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable, but I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. I would have called no matter who it was. This isn't about race. Jamal stared at the screen. Are you kidding me? He said, voice rising. She's really acting like this was nothing? His mother shook her head. She's protecting herself, she said. She knows she messed up, but admitting it means facing the consequences. Jamal clenched his fists. His pulse pounded in his ears. She's saying she would have called on anyone, Sue, he muttered. Like that makes it okay. His mother arched a brow. Would she have called if you were a white kid? Jamal didn't even have to think about it. Hell no. Then you already know the truth, she said simply. Jamal exhaled sharply. He wanted to respond, wanted to drag her in the comments, make her see how wrong she was. But then, another comment popped up, one from someone he didn't even know. A justice for all. Karen, if you would have called on anyone, why did you assume Jamal was a threat before even knowing who he was? Why didn't you ask him if he needed help? Why did you assume the worst? Because whether you admit it or not, that's racial bias at work. Jamal blinked. More people started replying, calling Karen out. This is exactly what racial profiling looks like. You weren't protecting the neighborhood, you were protecting your own biases. Apologize and learn from this. Jamal sat back, stunned. He had expected support from his friends and family, but strangers were standing up for him too. People he had never met were defending him, demanding justice. Wow, he whispered. His mother gave a small, proud smile. You see? Your voice matters. Jamal swallowed, feeling something in his chest, something warm, something hopeful. Maybe not everyone was blind to the truth. Maybe, just maybe. Some people were starting to listen. That night, Jamal lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone was still blowing up. His post had been shared over 1,000 times now. But even with the whirlwind of attention, there was one thing that stood out to him. For the first time since the police stopped him, he didn't feel powerless. His voice had been heard, his story had been told, and no matter what happened next, they couldn't ignore him anymore. Jamal barely got any sleep. Even after he put his phone on silent, the screen kept lighting up with notifications, comments, messages, shares. His post had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond his circle of friends, beyond his neighborhood. By morning, it was everywhere. He woke up to find his phone flooded with messages. His Instagram DMs were full. His Twitter mentions were blowing up. He rubbed his eyes, trying to process it all. The first message he saw was from Devin. Devin. Bro, have you seen this? You're trending. Jamal frowned, still groggy, and clicked on the link his friend had sent. A journalist from a major news site had picked up his story. Black teen, wrongfully profiled in his own neighborhood, how one social media post sparked a national conversation. Jamal's stomach flipped. This was big. His post wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a movement. He scrolled through the replies. Some people were angry, rightfully so. Others were sharing their own experiences of being racially profiled, using his post as proof that these things still happen. And then there were the people who still didn't get it. So tired of people making everything about race. Maybe just don't act suspicious? Ever think of that? Not everything is a hate crime. Calm down. Jamal exhaled sharply. No matter how many people saw the truth, there would always be those who refused to. He got out of bed, shaking off the heaviness in his chest. He couldn't control those people, but he could control what he did next. Downstairs, his mom was already up, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. Her phone was buzzing just as much as his. "Morning," she said without looking up. "Morning," Jamal mumbled, grabbing a piece of toast from the counter. Renee finally glanced at him. "You doing okay?" Jamal sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "I mean, this is way bigger than I expected. I just wanted to tell my story. I didn't think it would go viral," she finished for him. He nodded. His mom set down her coffee. "That's the thing about truth," she said. "When you speak it, it spreads. People who've been holding it in for years, they see you, and suddenly they don't feel so alone." Jamal sat down across from her, still processing everything. "What do I do now?" His mom studied him for a moment before answering. "You decide what you want this to mean. You can walk away and let the story speak for itself. Or you can use this moment to make people listen." Jamal thought about that. For years, he had watched stories like this unfold. Someone would post about injustice, it would go viral, and for a few days, people would care. And then, the world would move on. He didn't want that. He wanted people to remember. Jamal grabbed his phone. "I'm not done talking," he said. His mother smiled. "Then say what needs to be said." That afternoon, Jamal went live on Instagram. His hands were steady as he adjusted the camera, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's shared my post, who's reached out, who's stood up for me. It means more than I can say." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I also want to say, this isn't just about me. This happens to so many Black kids every single day. And most of the time, nobody listens. Nobody believes us. The cops show up, and we don't always get to go home." The comments were flying in. "Speak the truth. We hear you. This is real life for us." Jamal leaned forward. "I'm lucky," he said. "I'm lucky my mom is who she is. I'm lucky I got to walk away. But I shouldn't have to be lucky just to be treated like a human being. That's not how this is supposed to work." He could feel the emotion building in his chest, but he didn't hold it back. "So if you care about this, if you care about justice, don't just be angry for a day and then forget. Keep talking about it. Keep pushing for change. Because this has to stop." The comments flooded in. "We got your back, Jamal." "Say it louder for the people in the back." "Change is coming. We won't stop until it does." Jamal ended the live, exhaling deeply. His heart was racing, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was fire. An hour later, his mom got a call. Jamal was sitting at the table when he saw her expression change, her jaw tightening, her eyes darkening. "What is it?" he asked. Renee held up a hand, listening. Yes, I understand, she said, her voice controlled but sharp. No, I don't think silence is the right move here. We're not backing down. Jamal frowned. Who is that? His mother ended the call and set her phone down with a sigh. That was the mayor's office, she said. Jamal blinked. What? Renee gave a tight smile. It seems your post has made some people uncomfortable. Jamal felt a strange mix of nerves and pride. Good. His mom's smile widened slightly. That's what I said. She took a sip of her coffee before looking him dead in the eye. The police chief wants to meet today. Jamal's stomach flipped. This was really happening. This wasn't just a post anymore. This wasn't just his story. This was bigger. This was change knocking at the door. And Jamal was ready to answer. Jamal sat in the back seat of his mom's car, staring out the window as the city blurred past. He should have felt nervous. He should have been terrified. But instead, there was a strange calm inside him, like the moment right before a storm, when the air is still, but you can feel something coming. His mother, Renee, sat in the driver's seat, focused but quiet. She had dealt with people in power before. She had stared down criminals, corrupt officials, and politicians who only cared about optics. But today was different, because today, she wasn't just here as the FBI chief. She was here as his mother. She glanced at him through the rearview mirror. You okay? Jamal nodded. Yeah. She studied him for a second longer, then said, You don't have to say anything in this meeting if you don't want to. I can handle it. Jamal took a deep breath. I want to talk. Renee smiled just a little, pride flickering in her eyes. Then say what needs to be said. They arrived at the city's police headquarters, a tall gray building that looked as unwelcoming as the officers who had stopped him days before. Inside, the air was cool, sterile. The receptionist barely looked up before directing them to a conference room on the second floor. The door was already open. Inside, 3 men in suits sat on one side of a long table. The police chief, an older white man with sharp eyes, was in the center. Next to him sat the mayor, his expression neutral, as if he wasn't sure whether to be worried or annoyed. And at the end of the table was Karen. Jamal's stomach twisted at the sight of her. She wasn't wearing yoga clothes today. Instead, she was dressed formally, as if trying to appear more respectable. But there was no mistaking the tension in her shoulders. She wouldn't even meet his eyes. Renee walked in first, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't sit down. Instead, she placed both hands on the table and looked directly at the police chief. Let's cut to the chase, she said. Why are we here? The police chief cleared his throat. We wanted to have a conversation about the incident that happened earlier this week. The department is, of course, deeply sorry for any distress caused. Renee's voice was sharp. Distress? The room went silent. Jamal sat down, keeping his posture straight, trying to steady his breathing. The mayor spoke up next. Look, we understand that emotions are high. This situation has gotten a lot of attention, and we want to work together to... To what? Jamal interrupted, surprising even himself. To make this go away? The mayor hesitated. To find a solution that benefits everyone. Jamal scoffed. A solution? He turned toward the police chief. You mean a way to make people forget that your officers almost arrested me for standing outside my own house? The police chief's expression tightened. That's not exactly fair. It's not fair that I was treated like a criminal, Jamal snapped. It's not fair that I had to be scared for my life over nothing. It's not fair that this keeps happening to people who look like me. Silence. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Renee finally sat down, folding her hands together. This isn't about fairness. This is about accountability. Jamal saw something flicker in the mayor's eyes. Nervousness. He could tell they hadn't expected him to be this direct. But he wasn't done yet. You want a solution? Jamal asked. Then let's talk about what really needs to happen. For the next 30 minutes, Jamal and his mother laid it all out. The officers who had stopped him, they needed racial bias training, real training, not just some hour-long seminar. The department, it needed actual policies in place to prevent this from happening again. And Karen, Jamal turned to her, his voice firm but steady. You need to take responsibility for what you did. Karen finally looked up, her face pale. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she stammered. Jamal raised an eyebrow. But it did happen, and now you're sitting here, trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. I was scared, she said weakly. Jamal nodded slowly. And you never asked yourself why? Karen blinked. What? Why were you scared of me? He asked. What made you look at me, a kid standing outside his own house, and assume I was a criminal? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. Because they both knew the answer, she looked down at the table. I was wrong. Jamal wasn't sure if she truly understood, but at least she said it. At least she admitted it. Yeah, he said quietly. You were. By the time the meeting ended, nothing was officially resolved, but the weight on Jamal's chest felt a little lighter. As they walked out of the building, he turned to his mom. You think any of this will actually change anything? Renee slid on her sunglasses and smiled. We'll make sure it does. Jamal believed her. But he also knew that this fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black kid who had ever been followed in a store. Every kid who had ever been stopped by the police for looking suspicious. Every kid who had ever been afraid. As they got into the car, Jamal pulled out his phone. He opened Twitter and started typing. Had a meeting with the police chief today. They wanted to talk. But I didn't come to talk. I came to demand change. Because this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And we're not stopping until justice is real. Accountability. Change starts now. His mom glanced over as he hit post. You ready for what comes next? She asked. Jamal leaned back in his seat, staring out at the city. I think I am. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.